Welcome, everyone. I am Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSE as part of the ASCB Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Stanley Lowe, will be introducing our featured author for this installment of Online with LSE. Stanley, you can turn your camera on now.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Stanley Lowe. I'm here to introduce Dr. Erika Offerdahl. Dr. Offerdahl is an associate professor and the associate director for undergraduate education in the School of Molecular Biosciences at Washington State University. Research in the Offerdahl group examines quite a range of things, including assessment to visualization using methodology from cognitive science to really think about teaching and learning of biochemistry and molecular biology. So it's my pleasure to introduce Erika here today, and she will be talking, sharing with us and discussing with us her recent paper on fidelity of implementation of formative assessments.
Good morning, everyone. Let me share a screen here with you. Thanks, Stanley. I'm really excited to be here. And while I'm going to be sharing what we're going to be talking today is definitely within the context of our paper on fidelity of implementation that was published in CBE LSE, I'm hoping that this discussion will be more broadly about how we can use the fidelity of implementation approach to improve our research practices centered around high impact instructional practices. And let's see. I wanted to start though by acknowledging the co-authors for the paper that serves as fodder for discussion today. And that's Melody McConnell. She's a graduate student in at North Dakota State University in the Department of Biological Sciences, and then Dr. Jeffrey Boyer, who works in the College of Science and Math at North Dakota State University. He's the one ring that rules them all there and works with all of the science departments and is our educational specialist. So I'm going to just briefly provide some context for today's discussion. And I wanted to make clear that I'm working from the assumption that the folks in this community or the folks that are tuning in today are at least aware of the vast body of literature that demonstrates that when compared to traditional lecture, active learning does a better job at helping our students learn, except for when it doesn't. And I just wanted to draw some attention to this work by Dr. Tessa Andrews at University of Georgia, because this paper really got our lab group thinking about the work that we do. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with this paper from CBE LSE, the big take-home message is that when active learning is done in the wild with real biology instructors in real classroom environments, no matter how they measured student learning gains, they weren't able to detect a relationship between the amount of active learning that was happening in the classroom and student learning. And so this really caused our research group to scratch our heads, and I think a lot of other folks as well. And so really thinking about why, if there's this huge body of evidence showing that traditional lecture is largely ineffective compared to active learning, would we see this other result? And so one possible explanation is that, this body of literature that demonstrates the effectiveness of active learning really emerges from a large set of what are called or referred to as efficacy studies. And these are the kinds of studies that tend to have really tight, clean, quasi-experimental designs, often are implemented by folks who have some experience or knowledge about the instructional innovation that's being put into play, and it's often compared to a control. And that's in contrast to effectiveness studies. And those are when we take the innovation, now that we've shown that it's efficacious, and try to see how effective it is in real environments. These are sort of the studies that we would do to generalize the effectiveness of an innovation. And so these are a little bit messier, They're often implemented by instructors at large and represent a much diverse array of lecture settings. And so when we think about these two contexts, one might be led to hypothesize that really it's not that active learning doesn't work or whatever your instructional innovation is. It's not that it doesn't work, but it might be that there are some key ingredients that are missing. And it's those key ingredients that are producing an outcome that was unanticipated as compared to the efficacy studies. And so I'm tossing around this term active learning, which is really ill-defined. We don't have a good definition of it. If you read across the literature and recent national initiative documents, you can pull out some salient features of active learning, though, some key ingredients, if you will. And I've listed them here. For my lab group, as Dr. Lowe pointed out, we're really interested in assessment. And so one of the key ingredients of active learning is frequent formative assessment and feedback that is meant to help formative assessment both monitors student in progress learning, but then provides feedback on that so that you can reduce the gap between where the student is and where you want them to be. And so, our lab group kind of put this all together, the observations about active learning, but our general interest in formative assessment and feedback, to really start to wonder, are these differences that we see in some of the in the wild studies, can they be attributed to variations in how formative assessment is implemented in the classroom? And so that's where we were for a while. We were kind of cogitating on this. And then a brilliant paper came out by a colleague of mine, Dr. Marilyn Staines, in CBE, Life Sciences Education. And there they took a Fidelity of Implementation approach to understanding peer instruction. And really that paper called for us as a group of scholars to think carefully about these studies that we're doing that tell us about the effectiveness of different instructional innovations. And so for those of you who may not have had a chance to really read the paper, Fidelity of Implementation is just a way of thinking about the degree to which all of those key ingredients of an innovation are implemented when the practice is actually enacted. So we can think about what the prescriptive elements are for an innovation, but then when you hand them off to an instructor in real time, are those key ingredients present? I'd like to point out that Fidelity of Implementation is more than just whether or not the key ingredient is there. It's not just an on or off switch. Rather, you can think about it as a radio dial. So it might be there a little bit, it might be there a lot, or there might be adaptations to that key ingredient that were unanticipated by the original designers. And so those small differences, either in the presence or absence of a key ingredient, or in like how they were adapted, might actually be producing, or are likely to be corresponding with being able to help explain the observed outcome that you're measuring. And so Marilyn and her postdoc at the time, Trisha, I have the year wrong, I see on their paper, it's actually 2017. You can break down critical components of an innovation into structural components and structural components. And this comes out later in the list I'm going to show you. I just wanted to say briefly that structural components are kind of the nuts and bolts of the innovation, the procedure, and the things that you would expect to see in the classroom. So for formative assessment, you would expect to see some sort of prompt that an instructor would give. You would expect a student to make their thinking visible. That would be a structural critical component. There'd be feedback that would be generated to the student. That would be a structural critical component. The instructional critical components are all about behaviors and interactions between. So what are the expectations for how a student might interact? So one of the things that we would expect in a classroom is we would expect that students would attend to the feedback. that would be an instructional critical component. Those are just some examples. But for us, we decided that we were really curious about trying to unpack what those critical components are for formative assessment and feedback. And that's because in the literature, tends to be more holistic descriptions of formative assessment and feedback. They talk generally about characteristics, but haven't defined really succinctly what those critical components are. And so we leveraged the approach that Staines and Vickery described, but it was also described in previous literature by Mowbray and Century and colleagues. Ruiz Primo also used this approach. And it's really a three-prong iterative process where you dive into the literature and you look for empirical studies that would really demonstrate that a critical component has an impact on student learning. So you can go and look at single studies or meta-analyses to garner that information. The other step is to actually gather input from experts. So these are people who routinely identify themselves as formative assessment experts or are recognized for doing high quality formative assessment. And any manuals about formative assessment, you can do expert surveys. And then you can elicit opinions from users. So this is like getting into the classroom and pulling out your own personal observations about how things are working. But all three of those lenses you can use to iteratively go through and identify critical components, see how much evidence there is either in the literature or from the users that actually is important to the innovation, and then start to craft a better picture about what needs to be in place for the innovation in order to produce the learning outcome that you're hoping for. And so this, in our paper, we summarized how we weighted the evidence, what we looked for to consider something a critical component of formative assessment and feedback. And we used a scale that was similar to other scholars. What is different about our paper is that we also included theoretical support. So we looked not only for empirical studies, but also really robust and consensus in theory about how something should work. And so those things that had the most evidence, we deemed a 4 in terms of this is a critical component. There's a lot of evidence in the literature and from experts that this has to be in play for good formative assessment to occur. And then all the way down to a 1, where there's really just a little bit of evidence. It's mostly theoretical and it's only a couple of studies. And what that allowed us to do was to generate a list of the critical components of formative assessment and feedback. So you can see that there's the structural elements, like I described earlier, that need to be in play, and then the behaviors, the ways that students and instructors should behave during the innovation. And so the whole point of this essay in CB-LSE was to really be a call to the community to say, we think we've defined some of these critical components. We invite other scholars to join us in the endeavor to figure out for some of these critical components where there's less evidence, we're calling for the community to do research and help us verify whether or not they are critical components and the extent to which they are. And then the next step after that is once we've really kind of as a community found sufficient and very strong evidence for all the critical components, then it's posing the question of, do we have research instruments that would allow us to measure them? The idea being that if formative assessment is critical to student learning, are there variations in how instructors are enacting those critical components that we can map onto outcomes, student learning outcomes? And there are several potential tools out in the literature that measure aspects of assessment, and we created a not even close to being exhaustive list of them in our essay, but just some things that we felt we see frequently in the work that we read and in the work of others. And all of these measure facets of assessment, but might need some tweaking in order to measure a discrete critical component, for example, or to measure variations of that critical component. So I want to stop talking now because this is not a one-way discussion. I want to hear folks' thoughts about how they might use a Fidelity of Implementation framework to think about their own research or to think about their own teaching practice. But that's what I have for you right now.
So I want to hop on here as the facilitator to point out or remind everyone that there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So and that actually allows you to submit questions to us. You will not, you won't be able to see everyone's question, but we will see them as they come in, and we'll collate them and bring them up and as part of the discussion. So please feel free to submit questions as we continue to go along in the discussion. I'm perhaps going to start us off with a couple of prepared questions just to get the conversation going. So I'm wondering, Erika, what is what is your definition of a formative assessment, and how's that related to or different from active learning?
It's something that we grappled with, I think, as a research group. But I think it's become more clear, especially as more and more of the national reports have come out. I really view formative assessment as a process. And in our paper, the first figure we tried to articulate in model form what we mean by formative assessment. And so a formative assessment certainly includes the prompt or the question that you would give to the student. But as the whole process, it's meant to unearth or help us understand where the student is relevant to the learning comes that we articulate for them. And so formative assessment is really, in my mind, isn't really formative assessment unless you have a clear idea of where you want the students to go. And so you can use that evidence of student understanding to determine how close they are to achieving those learning outcomes, and diagnose where they are, and then decide what kind of moves I make as an instructor. Is the gap so large that I really missed it and I need to go and do some more teaching? Or is the gap small enough that I can really generate some meaningful and actionable feedback to the student? And so, that's ideally what we want, is formative assessments that are producing quality evidence and sufficient evidence for us as instructors to generate actionable feedback. And there's a whole slew of research on what makes effective feedback, but there's also a lot of, there's still a lot of discrepancy about what makes active feedback or makes actionable and good feedback. And I think that perhaps the Fidelity of Implementation approach might be useful, applying it to feedback and measuring. Formative assessment is also useful because students, if the formative assessment prompt is designed properly, that process of making their thinking explicit provides a real opportunity for them to generate feedback for themselves. And all of this is ultimately supposed to interact with things in a student box, like their metacognition and self-regulated learning, to help them do different things that will help them learn. So active learning, I think, is something we do in the classroom. I think that there's a lot of other aspects to it, but I think formative assessment is at the heart of it, that you wouldn't have active learning without formative assessment.
And could you have formative assessment without active learning?
That's another question. After sitting in, that I would love to hear what folks at home say, because I think there'd be lots of opinions about this. I think that in my mind, I'm thinking of an extreme case. So tell me what you think, Stanley. But An extreme case might be an instructor who's predominantly lecturing and then occasionally tosses in a clicker question. Is that active learning? Maybe. It's somewhere on this continuum between lecture only and student-centered. I think part of our problem as a community is that we call it active learning, but I think we mean something different. that we really mean we want to get to something that's very student-centered and very engages students at a high cognitive level and provides opportunities for them to test their knowledge and construct their knowledge in social situations.
Well, thank you. And since you have this figure up, you know, one of the questions is, what is the sort of behind the scene process in coming up with the logic like this? Like, how do you know, figure out what are the important nodes or boxes here and what are the important connections, and how did you and your co-authors define them?
That's a great question. Ooh, that went away. This is how do I say it? This is a model for us that allowed us to communicate about formative assessment. So it certainly is not complete. Each of those boxes could be further unpacked like crazy, but it allowed us to get on the same page. And here's one of the issues that we had early on. We would use formative assessment to mean both the process and the mechanism by which we elicit evidence of student understanding. And that's kind of problematic, right? So we would talk about, oh, we you know, we're observing this classroom and we see these sorts of prompts, these sorts of formative assessments being used. And I was like, whoa, wait, was that actually a formative assessment? I don't think it was, because there was no feedback for the student. So I think that this was kind of a box and arrow model, and that allowed us to more succinctly talk about what we meant. And a lot of it is pulled from other models. There's nothing, I think, any really novel about this one. It just worked for us to clarify what we were talking about as researchers. And I think that's really important for anybody doing any kind of research, especially if it's collaborative, to sit down and use a visualization to communicate with your collaborators, to have clarity about what the construct that you're measuring and what you all mean by it. And then the advantage of this one is that the arrows are trying to indicate some sort of relationship, but the downside of it is that it doesn't tell us everything. So in this student behavior box, which is the one that I think most of us are keenly invested in, all sorts of stuff are in there, like student metacognition. If student, and we actually had an original version of this model, we tried to put student metacognition in one of the boxes and have it somewhere over in here. And we knew it was important. We couldn't figure out how to put it in there. And ultimately, for the research that we're doing, we were focused more on the instructor behaviors. So we chose to just put it all in the student behavior box. And so another researcher who's looking more at the student stuff, you might ask the question of, well, what does a student perceive to be useful instructor feedback? And I would guess that metacognition it plays a role in that. From a Fidelity of Implementation standpoint, metacognition might be a critical component, or it might be a mediating factor, and that it's not something that you have direct control over, but it certainly impacts how things are interacting. But yeah, so in some ways this is an oversimplified model, and in some ways it's not an oversimplified model, but I hope that answers your question. But we just used it as a tool, and we had the literature help us, but then we negotiated based on what we were seeing in the classroom and in our own data, and used it to clarify what we meant by things.
So we have a few questions that have come in from the audience. And I guess they're sort of in a couple of different flavors. So first of all, the comments are, have that some of the audience commented on how useful and great this diagram is. And there are a couple of questions related to, pieces that you bring up that are not in this particular diagram or model.
Yeah.
One question was related to where you would put metacognition, which you have just addressed. And another is about where does instructor pedagogical content knowledge fit in to this framework here?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the model for us was a way of defining the parameter space. What is formative assessment and feedback, and why do we care about it? And then through the process of fidelity of implementation and going through the literature, that's when we started to see that though it was not represented on our mechanistic model, right, there are these critical components to formative assessment and feedback. And so as the question was about pedagogical content knowledge, it is a critical component in that an instructor must have some discipline-specific knowledge that allows them to readily diagnose where the student is, especially related to whatever, if it's a concept-based question that they're looking at. But then they also have to have the pedagogical skills to know what to do with that. So there's no, I used to work with K-12 teachers, and the principal I worked with said, there's no instructor-proof curriculum, right? We can design really perfect curriculum, but ultimately our teachers are the ones that are enacting it, and we need to support them so that they have a really rich set of experiences to draw from that help develop their pedagogical content knowledge. So indeed, we did find ample support in the literature that would say that pedagogical knowledge, specifically personal pedagogical knowledge and skills, as an instructional component. So that's where we found compelling evidence in the literature. As more folks get interested in this, though, they might find other compelling literature, or they might find some stronger theory that would then put other aspects of PCK as a critical component. I really view like this essay as a call to the community to help flesh these out more.
Great, thank you. So we have another set of questions here related to the model. I just want to remind everyone in the audience to please keep the questions coming in through the Q&A box. We are looking at them, and we're going to be grouping them and addressing them sort of in bulk together. So another set of questions related to that model diagram in Figure 1 is the variables that are involved. Are the boxes really only for observable variables, such as behaviors in this case, right? Or artifacts like written down learning outcomes? Or could unobserved variables such as thinking, metacognition could be incorporated, right? So what is the sort of thought process in setting those maybe, right, criteria or boundary conditions for what gets included versus not, and whether observable versus unobservable variables, could both be in here somehow?
In this model, because we were intentional about putting into the boxes things we could observe. So this model, for helping us define formative assessment, they are all kind of observable things, except for diagnosis of in-progress learning. That's a little bit harder to say as an observable thing. But that's not to say that directly observable things are the only variables that we would be interested in. And metacognition is a great example of one of those. And we just lumped it in here because we were more focused on the instructor side of things. But, to go back to the critical components, students' metacognition kind of is included in their ability to recognize and respond to feedback. So it's not stated as explicitly. I think the challenge with some of the variables, and we run into this in all sorts of educational research, is that some of them are really hard to get direct measures on. And it means we have to be really clever as scientists, and we have to, Julie Gaveau gave a really nice has several nice papers actually in CBE LSE that helps us think about how we're measuring cognition and the assumptions that we can make and the affordances and limitations of those data that we collect. So I think, the question, Stanley, if I'm hearing it right, is that in the model, the boxes were only observable things, but I do not think that we should restrict our research questions to only those things that are directly observable. I think we have ways to measure some of these latent constructs. It just means we've got to collaborate with good collaborators and be interdisciplinary.
Well, thank
I don't know
you.
if that answers the question that was in the Q&A, but I'm happy to have it refined too.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that brings us to your next set of questions is, what kinds of questions can we ask about, using this framework, right? And I think in your essay or paper, you brought up some examples of questions that are quite detailed, such as, thinking about where clicker questions should be placed in a lecture, whether they should be interspersed throughout, equally, not equally, or concentrated, right, in the first or second half of the class. You talked about thinking about different specific prompts for muddiest point, sort of short writing that comes at the end of class. Are there basically endless questions that we can explore here? So what makes some questions or variables or variations in fidelity more important than others?
I think this goes back to a talk that I heard a long time ago by Scott Freeman, where he said, we're really done with the experiments now that pit lecture versus not lecture. That we know that engaging our students works. And so now the question is, under what conditions do these particular pedagogical choices work, and for whom? And that's where I think the fidelity of implementation becomes useful, because it'll allow us as researchers to identify what we think are the important pieces and then measure variation in them. And your example of the clicker questions is a good one. And we're thinking about that right now. And because it relates tightly to formative assessment and feedback. So canonical peer instruction allows students to think about a question individually and then commit to an answer. And then, as Eric Mazur originally described it, the instructor would get to see how the students responded, but it doesn't get shown to students. Students then talk with one another and then they commit to an answer again. But I've been in a lot of classrooms where instructors say, yeah, I do peer instruction every day. And they show the distribution. And I show the distribution. I actually think, I hypothesize that showing the distribution is an important piece of feedback for the students. And then some instructors, when they show the distribution, they show, in addition to showing the distribution, they actually indicate which answer is correct, right? Before the students go and talk to one another. And therein lies a hypothesis again. Should we be showing them what the right answer is? Does that somehow shortchange the discussion that the students are going to have? Is it more important for them to have that kind of normative feedback about how the rest of the class voted, but not know the right answer so that they can talk about it? So I think fidelity of implementation allows us to ask slightly more mechanistic questions, with all the caveats that what we're measuring is hard to measure and we need multiple lines of evidence to try and drill down. From a practitioner standpoint, and I know that this is a journal club about the research, but I also think just from a practitioner standpoint, fidelity of implementation is very important. I think about POGIL, for example. POGIL, there's lots of research that shows us of the positive effects of POGIL. Sometimes I look at a POGIL activity and I think, I'm going to change this piece or I'm going to change that piece. And I never thought twice. And now I think about, golly, which of these pieces are really important, and how much can I alter those pieces before I ruin the important ingredient. So I think it can help us both as instructors and as researchers to be more reflective about the changes that we're making in the learning environment and what the effect might be on student learning.
Thank you. And we have a question related to what you were just talking about. Is what is the true, what is the goal here, right? Is it more important that students have the right answer, or the process that they go through, regardless of the answer, you know, whether they get the right answer or not, right? And this is something that you know, I also struggle with as an instructor in the classroom as well, and I imagine a lot of people struggle as well. And this is one of the questions that have just come in through the Q&A box.
I'm glad we all struggle with this. I'm happy to hear that other people struggle with that too. I think there's a lot of pressure to get students to get to the right answer. I'm less concerned about if they got to the right answer and more concerned that they're attending to appropriate, that they're drawing on appropriate resources and reasoning through it. I'm going to go back to that example of peer instruction and showing the right answer and showing the wrong answer. You know, as a form of feedback to the students, I've wondered about this. I wonder about the nature of the feedback we give students, and if it reinforces in their mind that there's a single right answer in science, and therefore de-emphasizes the reasoning that we so carefully tried to create opportunities for them to engage in the classroom, right? So I think our feedback does need to help students know that they're attending. You know, if they're examining data, they need to understand, they need to know that they're attending to those data appropriately, because a part of our job is to mentor them in the ways that we make sense of data. But I think it's unrealistic to tell them that there's a single way to interpret all data, right? We're scientists. We make really, we use data to craft an argument every time we write a scientific paper. And what we produce is our best guess given the evidence that we have. And somehow that gets lost to our students when we continually give them the message that there's a single right answer. So again, that could be a fidelity of implementation question. You could look just at the type of feedback that's given to students, and you could really carefully, you know, go in and find the critical components of feedback from the literature, and then design an experiment where perhaps you try and understand how focusing on the single right answer impacts how students think about science or how they reason through a problem. None of these questions are new. Fidelity of implementation doesn't lead to novel questions, but I think they allow us to more carefully define what it is we're looking at. It's just an approach or a tool, maybe.
So another question that came in sort of along the lines of this conversation is thinking about the importance of content in formative assessment. So earlier you mentioned higher level thinking, and you know, just now you were talking about, you know, crafting arguments from data and evidence. Is it possible for formative assessment to be sort of low on content? You know, so what is the, I guess there's a content and process involved, right? And are both important? Can it be high or low on one or the other, or low on both?
Your formative assessment should align with your learning outcome, right? So yes, and I guess I might need some clarification on the question. Is the question that whether or not the formative assessment can or should be include I'm not sure what I'm, maybe help me Sally. Maybe I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how does content, relate to formative assessment? So is it not an effective formative assessment if it is lower order thinking or lower order content?
Well,
Or is it that, right, yeah.
yeah, so maybe one way, maybe part of this question is content's not in a critical component, and is it a critical component that should be in here? That's a great question, because certainly content matters. It's what they're reasoning about, and it's what, the student is revealing student understanding about content. An instructor has a learning objective that likely has some content. And so this makes me think about, and I don't know why it makes me think about this, so I'm going to just think out loud like I do in lab group meeting. This makes me think about the paper by Laverty and colleagues, talking about the 3D lap. So that thinking about assessments, not just of content and not just of a Bloom's level, but really thinking about these three-dimensional assessments of student learning. And this list here doesn't really reflect that. And probably the reason why is that we were looking at just the formative assessment literature and not looking at it from a discipline-based perspective. So the discipline-based perspective would have to come in with the PCK and PCK-NS at this point, and at least how it's reflected here. But the effectiveness of the formative assessment then, if that's the question, like what makes an effective formative assessment prompt, then that content piece might be in here, where if you were going to measure it, you would look at the formative assessment prompt, and maybe something like the 3D lap would be useful, because you could look at the formative assessment prompt and say, is this looking at an overarching concept? Is it a cross-disciplinary theme? Are there authentic disciplinary practices that are putting into play? Or is it just a straight content question that's measuring a student's knowledge of a fact, which would be missing so many of those other elements that we of a three-dimensional assessment prompt. So assessment is woven in through here, and content is woven in through here, and content is really important. But that three-dimensionality might come in when you're looking at the formative assessment prompt and also at the feedback, perhaps. It's a good question. I don't know. That's my thinking out loud. I'd be curious to hear from the question poser if I went off the mark for what they were thinking, but yeah.
Thank you. And we got a confirmation that the idea of the 3D lab and the learning is sort of what the question was about, thinking about content.
Yeah, it's not in here. It's not explicitly in here. So it'd be interesting to see it'd be interesting to see if it is wrapped up in those others, or if it needs its own.
Yeah, well, sorry, I'm watching the time here, and I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time thinking and talking about different things that perhaps we should keep in mind for studies like this, or this particular study's implication for either research or education or curriculum in general. And I don't know where you want to start about the kinds of implications for the study. I think we talked a lot about the instructional side of things, so perhaps could start with what are your thoughts on your this particular paper's implication for what it means for the biology education research community?
I think it allows us a way of responding to the call for DBER 2.0 research, which looks at the impact of context and where we're not trying to just understand that student-centered strategies work, but really teasing apart some of the mechanisms. I think that something like this would be useful to a graduate student. I would have liked having this approach as a graduate student, because going through picking an instructional innovation like formative assessment, which that's kind of a big bucket, but you could do it for PI, which it was done actually. Marilyn did a really nice job with that, or with POGL, or whatever it is that you're doing. Going through a fidelity of implementation process allows you to more tightly for yourself make explicit how much evidence there is that something works, right? Is it just that there's a lot of theoretical support? That's good, that's important, but is there any empirical work? Or can we get something from the community that allows us to see that everyone believes this is an important component, and then allows us to measure it. So I think it allows just for a more systematic approach to inventorying those variables of interest that are likely to be affecting the desired outcome that you're trying to measure. So for me, that's what I've used it most heavily for, as a way to talk to my graduate students and to talk to my collaborators about, okay, wait a minute, we're measuring this thing, but do we even think it matters? Like, should we be measuring that? What evidence do we have to suggest? Is it empirical and theoretical? How much? Is it a lot or a little? Maybe we don't attend to that right now because these other questions are more important to attend to. It's not to say that those questions shouldn't be looked at or measured, but when you're embarking on a new piece of research, really having clarity about what's important to measure, I think is useful. So for research, that's what I would say. And we did talk a little bit about the instructional implications.
Thank you.
I also wonder, the implications for me is that, personally as a researcher, is that it's allowed me to look at really the wealth of work that's being done in the biology education research community, and understand how that research relates to student learning. And I know I'm being a little bit vague, but going through this process and identifying critical components, if I read someone else's paper that's really talking about instructors and their development of PCK, now that makes I really can see the power and how that potentially links to student learning in a way that I might be able to measure, that I couldn't before, right? The construct of PCK has been around for decades, and I've always believed it was important, and the community believes that it's important. But now I can start to think about, okay, mechanistically, I can see perhaps where this maps onto formative assessment and instructional practice, and then ultimately down to the feedback that's produced, and ultimately to student learning. So it's been useful for me in that regard.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to issue perhaps a last call for questions from the audience, to make sure that we have everyone's questions addressed. And perhaps we'll wait a minute to see if additional questions come in.
Yeah, what is the wait time in a real classroom is how long? What's the wait time in an online environment?
No, wait, I think it will depend on, it's at a fidelity of implementation when you change the context.
Yeah.
And I imagine, yeah, what if someone's typing a very long question?
Yeah, could be.
Should we ask them to say they have a question first and then we can, but anyway.
I would be curious, like, from the community, I look at all these instruments that we have, and they're good. I mean, these are good things that we have, and I'd love to hear from the community how these can be used. And like, let me reframe that question. So the instruments that we have, what are they most appropriate to be measuring, and in what ways can we leverage them to measure things that perhaps they weren't originally designed for? And, you know, that, for example, there are aspects of Portal that work really well for measuring fidelity of implementation. There are certainly, obviously, Bloom's is useful for fidelity of implementation. ICAP, probably. This kind of gets a little bit at the earlier question, although it still misses the content piece. But, you know, I would love for our community to use fidelity of implementation to think about the utility of these fantastic instruments that are out there. Not just for formative assessment, but I think a lot of these can be used in really cool ways.
Great, thank you. I think in the last few minutes, I want to make sure we get to the last 2 slides related to the webinar series in general.
Thank you.
I think.
Oh, that was that. I forgot. I should have put this up. Sorry, Stanley.
Oh no, this is actually the right place. So instead of the Q&A box, now we would like you to use the chat box instead. So this is also at the bottom bar for the Zoom window, but we're just going to collect some feedback.